One of the most important parts of interpersonal communication is understanding yourself. We can perceive others and look at others and evaluate others, but until we understand our own biases, judgments, and influences, we're not truly able to sincerely perceive others in a true and honest light. Our reality is constructed. What do I mean when I say reality is constructed? What I mean by that is that it comes from within us and not from outside of us. You can look at physical observation and say, yes, the grass is green or the sky is blue. But when we look outside of physical observation, the second order reality, those come from our own experiences, our own life perceptions, our biases, and our beliefs. One of the quotes in our textbook says, who you are and how you were raised are unique to you, and no one perceives the world exactly the way you do. First order reality explains physical observations, or what we can literally see and quantify. If we look at this picture, we see two benches with two women. We see a sidewalk, a brick wall. They have a couple of bags. They're probably senior citizens. That's about it. But if we consider the second order reality, this involves attaching meaning to realities that are founded only within our minds. So when you look at this picture, we don't truly know how these two women feel about one another. Someone looking at this photo might say, I think they're just being friendly to one another, right? Because they're both smiling. But another person might say, I don't think they like each other very much because they're on separate benches. And the woman on the right in the white jacket, I don't know, her smile looks a little bit forced and her nonverbal looks a little bit closed off. So these are all second order realities. These are just assumptions that we make when we're outside the situation looking in. There are 4 steps in the selection process when we decide what data we're going to process. When I say selection process, that decides what information we're choosing to wrestle with. If you're driving your car down the street, you should be focused on the road and how fast you're going. That should be your main focus. But we know that doesn't always happen. You could be really distracted because an awesome song just came up on the radio. Maybe there's someone in the passenger seat next to you who is distracting you. Maybe you have a cup of coffee in your lap and you want to make sure it doesn't spill over and burn your thighs. Maybe there's a really awesome car that just goes by, and maybe there's a hot person on the corner, right? We have all these different things that are vying for our attention, and we have to decide every minute of every day what's going to hold our attention. The first step is selection, or determining what data you will attend to. 3 things that really help differentiate what you pay attention to are intensity, repetition, and contrast or change. So if you picture me lecturing in a classroom and I suddenly start yelling, I've become much more intense, and I may be more likely to get your attention. If I repeat something over and over and over again, you might get bored, you might get tired of listening to me, but you may remember it. And if I suddenly change the entire role of the classroom environment, so let's say everyone's sitting there watching a prezi, listening to me lecture, and then suddenly I start tossing out handouts, breaking up everyone into groups, and telling everyone we're going to have a contest of some kind, I totally upset the balance and I've gathered everyone's attention because now we're shifting to something completely new. The next step in the selection process is organization. This is how we arrange our data flow in a meaningful way, or in a way that means something to us. We all organize things differently. If you consider physical organization, this could be maybe arranging something by size or color. Role-based organization talks about what role does it play or how important it is to us. Listening to your parent may outweigh listening to a distant friend. Your doctor may be more important than listening to your nurse or a nurse. You organize the data depending on the importance of who delivers the information. Interaction constructs discuss who we interact with as far as what is important to us. 2 good examples of this are, do I want to play a video game right now, watch Netflix, or do I want to log into Canvas and do my homework? We all interact with these 3 different things, but depending on where our priorities are and where our interests lie, those things are not going to have the same priority of organization for everyone. And finally, how does it make us feel psychologically? If we hate doing homework and it makes us feel really depressed, it's not something that we're going to organize very highly. Whereas if it's something we really enjoy doing or we get excited about it, that's something that we may place higher in our organizational structure for selection because it reinforces those good feelings. The third step is interpretation. Interpretation is attaching meaning to something, to our relationship satisfaction. If we're in a good relationship with a family member or a significant other, depending on how happy you are with that person, it's also going to depend how you perceive the person in that moment. Our textbook gives the example that if you are happy with the person, then you're more likely to see all the good. But if you're really upset with them, then you're more likely to see the bad, because when you're angry, you tend to more closely evaluate their personality and look for all the negative instead of embracing the person for who they truly are. Our expectations, our personality, and our own assumptions all play a role in how we interpret the world around us. If you see people who just sit around all the time, do you assume that they're lazy, or do you believe that they just like to take a few moments to be alone and reset and keep healthy mentally? When you see people who work out all the time, do you consider them to have body dysmorphia or be fitness freaks? Or are you proud of them for taking care of themselves? There are a million different ways that we can look at any situation, and how you interpret these individual behaviors differs from person to person. The fourth step is negotiation. A lot of this involves storytelling. When you're learning interpersonal communication, you may not just be able to read your textbook and understand the material. That's why we have lectures and worksheets and study guides to give you different ways to negotiate that information. Telling stories is really one of the most effective ways to teach, and this is why we try to include examples for everything that we do, so that we can put a process that we're familiar with to that information. It just helps everything be more digestible. People learn in stories and in narratives. I might just say narratives help the selection process, but that's kind of superficial. But if I tell a story where negotiation worked, you're much more likely to remember it. Negotiations can be very subtle. We can use words like influence and persuade, but oftentimes they're very subtle. An example could be in the classroom. I just might offer extra credit or convince students that they need to do their homework. I'm trying to influence how you learn sometimes. So again, the 4 steps in the selection process are selection, number 1, organization, interpretation, and negotiation. You may need to know those 4 steps for the exam. Physiological and psychological influences can be confusing because these words are very similar. Physiological involves the body, the physical body, how healthy we are. It includes things like our senses, smell, sight, touch, taste, and sound, our age, our health, whether or not we're tired, our biological cycles, our hunger, and our neurobehavioral challenges. Neurobehavioral challenges is a difficult one for some people to understand because some people may not know the difference between that and psychological influences. Neurology has to do with things like ADHD or dementia, things where their perceptions of the world are altered by the physical characteristics of the brain. When we look at psychological influences, we're basically talking about our mood. Are you happy, anxious, euphoric, depressed, bored? These are all moods. And moods are psychological ways that we evaluate the world. Whether or not you're happy or sad is going to have a huge influence on how we act and how we behave and how we perceive others. Our self-concept is one of the most important factors in perceiving teasing as something that's either friendly or hostile. I thought this quote was really important because sometimes in school, people may pick on each other, and depending on your well-being or your background or your mental health, not everyone would perceive teasing to be fun, lighthearted banter. If someone has really low self-esteem and they're being teased, they may not feel like it's friendly because their self-worth is so low. They may not believe that they're worthy of a teasing, friendly kind of a relationship. So just always make sure that when you are teasing people that you just let them know, right? To foster those friendships. You just let them know, hey, I'm just kidding. This can also bleed into the workplace as well. Someone might feel like there's just this happy exchange of teasing, but some other people might feel that's an unhealthy work environment. So just be careful because people are sensitive. Social influences include gender, occupational roles, and relational roles. Usually the first thing that you say when you introduce yourself to someone is your name, your location, and your occupation. So if I were to meet someone for the first time, I might say, "Hi, my name is Adam, and I live in Escondido, California, and I'm a professor of communication studies at Palomar College." Although it's a very short sentence, you've already figured out that I'm male. Someone may know my name, which is a superficial part of my identity. You also understand that I'm from California, and you might have some preconceptions about maybe my socioeconomic background, what growing up was like. Also, just telling you that I'm an instructor, someone might be wondering about my educational level, and they might be wondering what kind of things I do all day, what I dress like, what I look like when I go to work. These are all things that are forming assumptions, and that first impression is in their head. It's important to take a few moments to look at sex and gender. Sex is the physical characteristic. Like when your dog has puppies, you check its undercarriage before you name it to figure out whether or not it's male or female. Gender is actually considered a psychological dimension of masculine and feminine behavior. I'm not trying to change any belief systems or get you to feel a certain way. I'm just asking you to be open-minded and review these terminologies. They are somewhat controversial today, but they're also very important because just because someone's born a male or a female, that doesn't necessarily reflect how we feel inside. Here we're kind of reviewing some of the terminology that we had in Chapter 1, where you have phrases like high context or low context, also known as achievement or nurturing cultures. You have terms like co-cultures and, of course, your intercultural communication competence. I have this picture of tea up here because in certain customs, tea is a very important ceremonial ritual. In certain cultures, you don't just roll up into a Starbucks and get a grande tea and carry it around with you all day. In certain places, you sit down, you fold your napkin, you pour your cup in a certain way, you turn your cup in a certain direction, and you really enjoy that cup of tea with whomever you're with. It's not something that you just normally pick up and go. So these are high context, nurturing techniques that have a cultural meaning woven into that ritual or that ceremony of having a cup of tea. It's very different from anything that we're familiar with in our society or those cultures that don't believe in having coffee to go. Our culture, whether it's something like having a cup of coffee or how we speak to one another, they all have a huge influence on how we perceive the outside world and how we perceive each other. Co-culture also affects perception. There are some studies about using photos of children of various races, and unfortunately, participants often consider children that are black or Hispanic to be older than white children. It's a skewed perception in one of the studies that our textbook talks about. The textbook also talks about a term called attribution, and that just means how we describe and attach meaning to certain behaviors. We definitely get into this when we talk about stereotypes. Stereotyping is exaggerated beliefs with a categorizing system, and we're not talking about positive ones in this scenario. These are not important, crucial, or critical observations. They are completely superficial and unimportant, and sometimes they can be immature. We then ascribe a set of characteristics to most or all of a group. So if I were to say that all people from California are dumb hippies, that's a stereotype. That's not true, and when we're making these stereotypical assumptions and then applying these generalizations to a specific individual. So if someone from out of state said all Californians are dumb and shallow, and then they meet one person from California, they might say, hey, look at this dumbass, right? This is how stereotypes are fostered. Stereotyping and prejudice are some of the words in our text that we're most familiar with, but I find time and time again that when it's time to sit down and define these terms or include them in an exam, people really struggle with the definition. So please take some time to review this section in your textbook. I always ask this question, and I'll just let you sit on it for just a moment. Are first impressions accurate? No, they are not, for several reasons. Chapter 3 talks about how we're most often not fully forthcoming and honest when we meet new people. We also make assumptions about people. If I'm going back to my California example and I tell someone that I live in Escondido, California, they might automatically assume that I'm a farmer, a tweaker, or a retiree. When in truth, I was raised on Guam, and I actually moved to Orange County, California, and I've traveled extensively. They may not understand my depth or my world knowledge. They just might make assumptions. I'm going to skip implicit bias. You don't really have to be concerned of that, and just go straight to primacy effect. Primacy effect is our tendency to pay more attention to and recall things that happened first in a sequence. Again, just like your first impression with your friends. Even though you may have been friends for years, you probably remember the first day you met that person. Your perception for some of them might not have changed, but for some of you, you might have realized that you unfairly judged them in the beginning. The halo effect describes the overall ability to think of someone positively, even though they may have only done maybe a few or even one nice thing. Maybe you read that someone donated a bunch of money to charity. You might always think of that name in association with someone being a good and giving person. The horns effect is the exact opposite. If you've never met someone and you find out someone has done something wrong, you may forever judge them on the one poor decision that they made. Confirmation bias is when we try to reinforce our knowledge about our biases. We tend to seek out and organize information that reinforces or supports what we already believe in. Let's say you're a Republican. You might read nothing but Breitbart News and watch nothing but Fox News because they reinforce what you already believe. Same thing if you're a Democrat. You might read nothing but the Huffington Post or BuzzFeed articles because they reinforce what you already believe politically. So confirmation bias is just where we're looking for our opinion not to be challenged. Confirmation bias is also very much a part of a self-serving bias, or the tendency to give more weight or more importance to our own qualities and make attributions, or the process of attaching meaning to another person's behavior. For example, your textbook says that if you give someone a task to do and they don't complete it, we might say that they made the mistake, or they weren't listening, or they weren't paying attention. But if the role was reversed and we made the mistake, we wouldn't blame ourselves and say, I wasn't listening. Instead, we would turn around and say, they didn't give us appropriate directions. So this is just a good reminder to avoid a self-serving bias. If we're ever in a position of power, or maybe we're a manager, instead of blaming someone the first time they do something wrong, take the time to ask them, did I explain this correctly? Did I give you good directions? Because another person's failure to meet our expectations is much more of a mirror of ourselves than it is for another person. We are influenced by all these different biases. Bias is defined as an inclination of temperament or outlook, especially of a personal and sometimes unreasonable judgment or prejudice. Bias is something that we have to work very hard to tamper and break ourselves out of. Perception checking is a great way to help overcome our biases and improve our own interpersonal communication skills. There are 3 steps to perception checking. First is to describe the behavior that you noticed. If I were outside, jumping up and down or dancing in a parking lot, are you going to tell everyone that I'm crazy, or are you going to check your own perceptions? And how we would do that is explain different interpretations of the behavior. Am I jumping up and down because I'm mad that my car won't start? Or am I jumping up and down because I got really good news and I'm really excited? Or am I trying to flag down a car because someone is injured? There could be 100 different reasons that I could be jumping up and down in a parking lot. And an even better way to determine my behavior is by seeking clarification. You can always seek clarification and ask the person, what was going on out there? Why were you jumping up and down in a parking lot? I could have a completely logical explanation that would make your initial knee-jerk reaction of saying that I was crazy to be completely unfounded. Perception checking is really important, especially if you have someone in your life that you struggle to get along with, or you find yourself disliking. And sometimes you don't always know the reason why. So take some time to check your own perception of those things that drive you crazy. Take some time to really interpret those behaviors. It's really a great way to improve interpersonal relationships, both with the people that you like and the people that you don't get along with very well. Empathy is a word that I've been using since our first chapter, and it's something that we're going to continue to explore. This is the ability to put yourself in someone else's shoes. This is the ability to experience the world from their perspective or their point of view. And I find the best way to gain empathy for people is by interacting with them. If you don't understand why someone acts the way they do or feel the way they feel, then take some time to get to know that person, because deep down we all want to know each other better. We want to have more friends. We want to have better working relationships, whether it's in the classroom, at the workplace, or wherever. So just take the time to get to know people. And you can start with, where are you from? How'd you grow up? What was your family like? Take time to build those relationships. They're going to be very valuable. Again, please take the time to review the objectives for this chapter. These are the key objectives for chapter 4, and any of this is going to be subject to be on the exam. I'm going to keep this lecture short and sweet, guys. I hope you guys are doing great. Take care.